Hi everyone, and welcome to our Q&A with WWF experts. And today, the discussion is really about what did we achieve in 2023. And we'll be looking back at some of our successes and actions from last year and how we helped restore the natural world, both on the ground, but also through our advocacy at the international level.
We're also going to be looking ahead for 2024, which will once again be a busy year for us. But before we dive into this, we'll wait as more people join online, live stream, both on Instagram and YouTube. And whilst we wait, if there are any questions or highlights that you want from 2023 to flag yourself when it comes to climate and nature for you, do let us know.
Yeah, any sort of positive piece of news from last year that really stuck with you, or any specific event from 2023 that you would like to mention in relation to climate change or the loss of nature, please let us know in the comments. It would also be great to know actually where you're watching us from, where you're based. At the moment, we are in Woking, not too far away from London in the UK, where the office of WWF UK is located.
And if you have any questions as we're going along, please don't hesitate to drop them in. And we'll try and answer as many as we can, as many as possible. Right, should we get started then?
Yeah, of course. Let's do it. So once again, if you're just joining us, welcome to this WWF Expert Q&A live on YouTube and Instagram. And it's really about what we achieved in 2023. And we're going to look back at all successes or actions last year, and also looking actually at the world ahead and looking at what's going to happen in the next few months. So my name is Clement Metivier. I'm the head of international advocacy at WWF UK. And basically my job is about influencing global processes, influencing global agreements on nature, on climate change. And that's really about engaging and working with governments, for governments to accelerate action at the international level, for obviously everybody to hold governments accountable and deliver on their promises.
And my name is Paul Ornellas. I'm the Chief Advisor for Wildlife here at WWF UK. And my role focuses on the work that we do on wildlife, our species programs, influencing wildlife-related policy, and working with colleagues around the world to try and help support wildlife conservation.
Right. So yeah, I guess let's get started on the successes of 2023. And we have actually selected a few of them. So Paul, why don't you tell us about some of the success stories from 2023 and how, with the help of our supporters, we have achieved big successes on nature restoration to really help in bringing our world back to life.
Ooh, indeed. So the work that we do on species that I'm involved in is really critical to enable us to what we describe as bending the curve on biodiversity loss. I think many of us are aware of the decline in biodiversity, the threats it faces, and if we want to turn that around, support nature recovery, these are some of the things that we need to do. And we have had some incredible successes in 2023 that we would like to celebrate. I think one that springs to mind is that last year the Global Tiger Forum released its latest estimates for global tiger numbers and reported that the population had increased from as few as 3,200 tigers up to over 5,500. And this reflects nearly a doubling in tiger numbers. If you go back to 2010, governments that are home to tigers, what we call tiger range states, made a commitment to try and double tiger numbers in the following 12 years, which is a lunar cycle, the year of the tiger to another year of the tiger. And we've nearly achieved that. That's an incredible achievement. And notable successes on this journey, which we refer to as T times 2, doubling tiger numbers, came from South Asia, particularly India and Nepal, where WWF UK, through our supporters, have been investing long term. And finally seeing those increases in tiger numbers alongside the benefits for people and nature that this work has delivered. And if you look at Nepal in particular, Nepal actually saw a tripling in tiger numbers in 2010 from about 120 up to nearly 360. And why does this matter? Now, for someone like myself, and for many people watching and listening, an increase in tiger numbers is something worth celebrating in and of itself. But you should really think of this as almost more than tigers. That tigers are a flagship or even an indicator for the places in which they're found. And what we need to do to increase tiger numbers, or to look at this impact, was actually an awful lot more. So protecting tiger habitats, wider biodiversity. Tigers need to eat things, so tigers prey. Making sure that people have incentives for living alongside tigers, and also making sure that habitats are connected. Tigers need to be able to move, and if tigers can move, other species can move. So benefits not just for tigers, but for people and wider nature. Also, in 2023, just towards the latter half of the year, we saw what we called a global declaration for river dolphins. And what happened here was that many of the countries in which river dolphins are found came together and made a commitment to try and address some of the issues that are affecting river dolphins and their freshwater homes. And what this enables us to do, as we look forward, is it provides the basis for taking action to address some of these threats. And river dolphins, sadly, are one of the most threatened group of species on the planet. They're all highly threatened with extinction, and their freshwater homes are also threatened with degradation as well. We're seeing things like pollution, we're seeing overfishing, bycatch, and also things like dams and other infrastructure breaking up the connectivity of those rivers. And of course, rivers and freshwater systems are things that we all depend on. And so both of these examples sort of illustrate the connection between wildlife species, the things that are threatening them, the things that need to happen for them to recover, and how we can benefit as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really great that you have that, obviously, that focus on the conservation work on the ground, on species like tigers, like river dolphins. And I think now I want to bring us back to another area of work that WWF is very active, which is trying to influence global decision-making processes, global agreements taken on nature, on climate change, I guess on the other side. And something I would like to mention, looking back at 2023, is COP28. And COP28 was a big climate change summit that happened in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates in December. So quite fresh, actually. And I was actually there with many other practitioners and experts and activists from WWF and from many other organizations. And obviously there were 200 governments as well on the ground in that climate conference. And obviously COP28, this climate summit happened in a context where the climate crisis is accelerating, where the impacts of the climate crisis on ecosystems and communities is getting even bigger. And actually 2023 was assessed as the warmest year on record. So there is that really important issue of the climate crisis that is at the forefront of global discussions. And a few things happened at COP28 that I think are quite positive. And COP28 was actually called by WWF a significant moment for global climate action. And there are a few areas that I want to highlight as part of those positive signals that came out of that climate summit in 2023. And the first one is the issue of fossil fuels. And at COP28 in Dubai, all countries committed to transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I think this is a very important signal, and that hopefully will bring the sort of beginning of the end for fossil fuels. And obviously we know that exporting oil, coal, gas is actually fueling the climate crisis. And I think that sort of commitment from governments to commit from moving away from those is quite important. And I guess connected to that, there's also the issue of renewable energy. And at COP20 in Dubai, there was a global commitment, once again, a pledge to triple the world's renewable energy capacity. And I think this is very important to support the deployment of clean energy like wind and solar all around the world. Another issue I wanted to mention is deforestation. Because when we talk about nature, the issue of deforestation is obviously coming very quickly to us. And in Dubai, in that climate summit last year, all governments agreed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And maybe coming back to the UK, we had a sort of confirmation from the UK government that all supermarkets in the UK would have to make sure that the food they import from other countries is not coming from illegally deforested land. And talking about food, I also have to tell you a little bit about this issue of food and how it relates to the climate crisis. Because at the moment, the consumption of food is linked with 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. And food production is also the primary driver of deforestation in the world. And this issue of food was actually quite high on the agenda at COP28, at the climate summit. And so, for example, you had more than 160 governments, including China, the US, the UK, committing to really include food in their national climate plans and policies by 2025. So there is also action happening there. One last element I want to mention, connected with that climate summit that happened last year, is this issue of climate impacts. And obviously, we know that it is very important to provide funding for the communities and for the countries that are most affected by the climate crisis. And in Dubai, there were very important financial pledges made for a fund that is going to help and support those countries and communities.
Okay, great. So a lot of positive news then from 2023 for both nature and climate, I think we can agree. But it wasn't all rosy, still work to be done. And even COP28 didn't deliver everything that we would have hoped, isn't that right?
Yes, I have to say, at the end of the day, obviously the climate crisis, also the biodiversity crisis, they are huge, they are very interrelated, and they have a lot of impacts. And I think the action that has been taken so far is probably not enough. And these international agreements, like the agreements that were taken last year at COP28, are maybe a step in the right direction, but they are definitely not enough to put us on the right path, on the right track. So I think that obviously there are some challenges, and I think especially looking at that climate summit, COP28, there are some areas where we would have expected more to be done. And coming back to this issue of the energy transition, how do we move from fossil fuels to clean energy? I think more could have been done. And there were some loopholes actually that were included in the agreement that opened the door for delaying action on that energy transition. So I think that was one area where we would have expected more progress and more ambitious commitments from government on this energy transition. And maybe another area where I think much more action was needed last year at COP is this issue of finance. And obviously there was some money put on the table to help those countries and those communities vulnerable to climate impacts, but it's not enough. Basically, we need billions, not millions, to help those affected by the climate crisis. And I think the wealthy nations of the world have to come up with those funding commitments, and they didn't really do that last year in Dubai.
Absolutely. And despite some of the great conservation wins and some of them we just talked about, it is impossible to ignore that so much still needs doing. The threats are still ongoing, and the threats that our natural world is facing are still there. And thinking in terms of challenges about what I was just discussing, I mentioned the increase in tiger numbers that we celebrate, the T times 2 that was virtually achieved. And whilst we have seen an increase in tiger numbers between 2010 and 2023, tigers are actually found in less places than they had been in 2010. Sadly, we've lost tigers from a couple of countries in Southeast Asia, so Vietnam and Laos. So the threats that tigers face, habitat loss, poaching, increasing conflict with people. Tigers are difficult things to live alongside. And ever more fragmentation of habitats and so on. Those are all still there, all still things that we need to address. And we've spoken about the climate challenge and the changes around linked to climate and the impacts on people and nature, something that we're already living with. And we saw that with river dolphins. You may have seen that towards the end of last year, there was a tragic die-off of river dolphins in Brazil. Last autumn, around 10% of all the river dolphins in Lake Tefé died in just 1 week as a result of drought and intense heat. The water in that part of the lake and the river system there rose to nearly 39 degrees. at one point, and obviously that's something which the river dolphins couldn't tolerate, and also has impacts for the people who live and depend on those freshwater systems as well. So we're already seeing the threats and the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and nature. So with all that in mind, about both the successes and the challenges for 2023, what are we looking to achieve? What are we hoping for from 2024?
Yeah, well, I believe obviously there is a lot of work on the table for everybody to really accelerate action on the environment, for climate, for nature, and for communities. And I think that looking back at sort of international agreements and holding governments to account, we still need to see much more action from governments and from other stakeholders. For example, thinking about the private sector, to tackle the climate crisis, to tackle the loss of biodiversity. And I think that we still need to see nature and climate really high on the agenda, on the international agenda, but also on the national agendas. And I think that on the issues to watch this year, the issue of finance, once again, is going to be quite important. Because obviously a lot of commitments, a lot of pledges have been made in the past. But what we have noticed is that they are under-delivered, that the financial means to implement them are not on the table. So in 2024, we expect governments to walk the talk, to really put the money on the table, to deliver on their past pledges. But we also expect governments and other stakeholders to actually put more money on the table to protect species, to halt and reverse deforestation, to really tackle climate change. And what I want to say is that often we talk about those things as a cost, but I think it's rather an investment, and an investment we make into a more sustainable, a more resilient, a healthier future for us and also for future generations. And actually, we have actually realized that saving the world is cheaper than destroying it. So there is no reason not to do it.
I'm persuaded, definitely. And this is why WWF UK works both on policy, professional processes that set the framework that enable us to do the things that we need to do and see the changes that we need to see. We need to see countries commit. We need to see more action. And in 2024, that movement from commitment to action and delivery is something that we really need to be focusing on and holding governments and ourselves to account to do. We're thinking ourselves, WWF has a new 12-year strategy for tigers. We've been looking not to double or triple tiger numbers. Obviously, we want to see populations increase, but also thinking about range expansion as well. So I mentioned the idea of tigers vanishing from some of their former homes. We'd like to see that reversed, and we'll be focusing on 22 landscapes to try and see this happen over the next 12 years. I mentioned the River Dolphin Declaration. So that's great. That provides the framework for action, but we need to make sure that governments not just commit, but actually deliver that action on the ground and in the water for river dolphins addressing those threats. So yeah, definitely in 2024, a focus on delivery and the threats that we need to address. And I think the point on finance, that's a really important one as well. We had a question on Instagram about some of the challenges facing the work that we do. And I think being able to resource things, to be able to sustain these things. So having the finance and the gap that you mentioned and the funds that are needed to deliver our nature and climate goals, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face. So I think needing to see that addressed in 2024 and long beyond, I think it needs to be a real focus.
Yes, definitely agree. Thinking about 2024 and very much in connection with this issue of delivery and finance, I think there's a lot of attention that has to be put on also national policies and national plans and what governments are doing to mobilize this funding, to give a bit more detail and a bit more clarity on what they're actually going to be putting on the table to help with solving climate change, with solving the biodiversity loss. And I think we expect governments to really, this year, prioritize solutions that work for nature, for climate, and for people. And I talked about food earlier, and I think that, for example, there are solutions like agroecology, like organic farming, and they deliver those benefits across the board, and those have to be prioritized. And at the same time, I think that governments have to step away at the same time from things that basically don't work. And so, for example, going back to the UK, we know that granting oil and gas licenses in the North Sea is not good for people. It's not good for climate change. So we expect governments, and we will hold governments to account, to basically stop what is harming nature, what is harming the climate, and what is harming communities.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And one of the questions we've had come in just now whilst we've been talking, I mentioned the role of WWF UK supporters. We're very fortunate in that we have adoptions linked to our species work. We have a suite of species that people can take out adoptions on. And what that money supports, it supports our conservation work. I mentioned for tigers, for example, our tiger adoption, those funds go to India, to Nepal, where we've seen successes around increasing tiger numbers. And they also support our Wider Tigers Alive initiative, looking at a whole host of different issues around tigers. But we're fortunate in that work goes to support conservation in East Africa, in Latin America, through our jaguars and river dolphin work, but also globally, looking at things like marine turtles and a host of other things. It's really something that delivers really, significant impacts and enables us to do the conservation work that we do on species around the world. So one of the things also that we had to talk about when we were talking about some of these sort of global processes and frameworks, although it didn't quite fall in 2023, was something called the Global Biodiversity Framework. I don't know if you could say a bit about why that might be important for nature and climate.
Yes, of course. So obviously, when we talk about what is going on at the international level to address the issue of the loss of biodiversity, we had that global agreement that was basically adopted at the very end of 2022. So let's just consider that as part of what we are talking about today. And yes, it's called the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's basically all governments coming together and having that plan for the next 10 years. It's until 2030 for 8 years. And the goal there is really ambitious. And it's really actually what we need to bend the curve, as you say, to really take the loss of nature and putting it on the other side to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. And so there is this plan that has been adopted by governments. It has a series of goals and targets, which are great. But where we are now is that has to be implemented, that has to be delivered, because it's a very ambitious plan. It has a very ambitious vision and mission for 2030. But now we are looking to what governments are actually putting on the table to take that global biodiversity framework and make it an actual plan for action at the national level, but also at the local level. And obviously what we hope is that at the end of the day, having this international agreement is going to accelerate efforts for conservation, for the protection of species and ecosystems, but also for efforts to accelerate action on the drivers, on the root causes of the biodiversity crisis. So for example, finance, because at the moment we know that there is money coming into activities that are harming nature. And that framework hopefully can help to redirect that finance towards activities that are beneficial for nature. I talk about food, and I think there is this issue of transforming the way we produce and consume food. And that has a key role to play to protect nature, to make sure that farming is nature friendly. So I think there's a lot to be done on that issue of delivering that international agreement and make sure that it works at the national level, at the local level for projects, and at the end, we also expect citizens and other stakeholders to hold governments to account, to remind governments that they have agreed on that framework, and now that it's time for delivery and implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone working on wildlife on species, I think the Global Biodiversity Framework and the targets it sets around species, habitats, restoration is really, really important as a sort of a guiding framework. We mentioned bending the curve on biodiversity loss, halting and beginning to reverse the decline in nature by 2030, which is obviously something that we're working hard to try and achieve. The fact that that's part of a global agreement then enables us to try and hold governments to account, ourselves to account, into making that tangible action that actually delivers for people and nature. And I think it's a really neat example of how policy can intersect with that conservation work on the ground, because the policy is set the framework, and then we need to translate that, as you say, nationally, locally into action. But it can provide that sort of guiding light and way for us to sort of hold governments to account into action that actually delivers. And I think it's a useful way to think about how these things land in terms of conservation action. So yeah, I think very, very valuable.
And on that, I think there's also a role to be played by citizens and everyone, really, everybody watching us, for example, at the moment, in terms of holding governments to account, reminding your elected officials, reminding decision makers and anybody that you come across that obviously we have those commitments and pledges that have been taken on climate, on nature, that have to be delivered because we have obviously no time to lose. And I think that's also one key priority for 2024. If we talk about implementation and delivery, it's also about all of us to make sure that those commitments, those decisions are delivered in whatever our local elected officials are doing, in what, I don't know, retailers are doing, because everybody goes grocery shopping and can make decisions and have an influence on that. So I think that's also a sort of call to action for everybody to inform themselves, to hold governments to account, and to focus on that in the month to come, because those issues, nature and climate, they are not going to leave the top of our concerns, and they're going to require a lot of work in the coming month.
Indeed, indeed. So I think it sounds like that's where we're coming to the end of our time here. And
actually, a question just came from Instagram around working with and applying pressure on governments, and a question about WWF meeting with them. And yes, that's true. I think it's very important for us to directly engage with decision makers. And for example, referring back to the COP28 Climate Summit, we had many meetings with the UK government and with other governments to share our priorities, to share our key messages and our asks, and really try to shift their positions for governments to become more ambitious. So I think that's a way to apply pressure, to directly engage and meet with governments, and obviously share all messages, always based on evidence and what we see from the ground. And also come together as groups and coalitions. It's not just WWF, it's WWF and many other organizations from civil society coming together and engaging with governments. And obviously beyond that direct engagement, beyond just those meetings with governments, we have campaigns, we have communications that are also targeting the UK government and other governments. So I think we are using different tactics to, as you say, apply pressure on governments. I think this term of applying pressure is very important, because that's what we want to do. We want to remind governments of where we stand and the fact that they need to be much more ambitious on climate and nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have a role to play in applying pressure on governments in that context. So I think we definitely are this time coming to the end of our time for today. Thank you to everyone who joined, and of course to everyone who submitted questions. We hope you leave a little more hopeful about the work being done to bring our world back to life, and about the future of our natural world.
Yeah, and now that you obviously had all this information, obviously there are many ways that you can keep supporting WWF and the work we do, be it by becoming a member, be it by taking up an animal adoption, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even just sharing our content with friends and family, spreading awareness of the things we've been talking about the state of nature and climate. So don't forget to follow us on social media. Sign up to our newsletters. We'll give you regular updates on the vital work that we carry out, bringing our world back to life.
Yeah, and obviously if you would like to catch up on this Q&A, it will be available on YouTube and on Instagram as well.
Many thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.